Poetry is not literature, rather a vehicle to explore the imperceivable yet profound elements of one's own internal reality. Poetry requires an effortless grace, a deft touch to sink seamlessly into one's own being and bring back implicit fragments of a greater whole. Based on that, there is a kind of transcendent notion to poetry that I would also assign to art. There's something about that realm that inspires a level of beauty, inspiration, illumination, and these are the core tenets of what inspires me about creativity and something that I'm called to express into the world. And with poetry, of course, it's a medium that uses words rather than visuals. So it's a little bit more, you could say, confined into the world of language and communication. But at the same time, it's not, because poetry is very well known for sparking visuals within the words. So it toes the line between every realm and every aspect of our imaginary lives, and also draws from the external physical experiences that people have. I have found myself called to it as a younger child at times, as a teenager, and parts of school were very much influenced on poetry, but it was nothing compared to the lived experience of it now and how I apply it as a form of yoga. That kind of writing with a poetic intent brings me into a place that I can't describe and I can't really replicate in any other area of life other than the actual, probably fullest, richest version of life and its experiences of just living spontaneously. You know, when you kind of just lose yourself in the moment and you're in some kind of weightless bliss because there's no inner dialogue, there's no monologue, and you're able to just immerse yourself into the kind of unity of the moment. And that's what poetry does for me in a specific moment. It's almost like a singularity into the present moment, opening up a Pandora's box of potential challenges and catalysts. There's usually tension that fuels me to be writing poetry in the first place. It could also be a very open channel of inspiration. There's something about the balancing point between exploring and expressing our individuality, recognizing what it is that is shared within the human experience, and then also knowing and understanding that we have our own we plug in, we filter our own subjective lens, right? And that part, while it seems like, oh, that's not so great, we can't really rely on things, I want things to be objective, I want to know what is real in life. Unfortunately, I don't really agree that that's a priority. I think there's a beauty in the difference. And one thing that we'll discover the more we explore poetry is what tends to unite every one of the most influential poets, be it from ancient times, to the Sufis, to the medieval poets, to the Renaissance romantics, to the French, Italian, all the variation, even to the modern day, even to the likes of Jung, who I would actually argue was a poet in himself, in his philosophy, in the way I'm going to explore poetry in this episode. You'll see what I mean, because it has everything to do with contradiction, with the tension of the opposites. And that's what differences between humans are all about. And it's those differences that give us a richness. We don't want to be the same as the next person. We don't want to play nice and adapt ourselves. It's something I've struggled with a lot in my life. And actually you realize that when you actually choose to express that and give it form into the world, which is, as I would consider, a form of poetry, allowing what arises to come through, not to let it stew in the amalgamations of editing and almost using our software that is not really designed to be tempered with. We're meant to kind of just let things flow as a kind of creative process. Even in conversation is a creative process, because we don't know what we're going to say next. I'm almost having a conversation with you now. I don't know what I'm going to say. That's the whole point of this. That's why I'm doing this, is because I love experimenting with spontaneity. Lately I've also been exploring the difference between personal and impersonal poetry. The impersonal will, as I say, draw upon archetypes that unite the collective. They tend to take us out of our personalized ego and talk about things that really hold themselves into a bigger picture. They move the consciousness of the collective just by being what they are. That these big archetypes that unite us all. Like the hero, for example. The hero's journey. I'm very passionate in mythologizing our own lives, being the hero of your own journey. No matter how mundane or unremarkable your life looks, see it as a living poem, because what else are you going to do with your life? If your life isn't a mythology and a story worth living, then you're going to live it through other people, or you're going to be obsessed with other stories. A lot of people might externalize all of this powerful potential into other realms, whether it's in their own imagination, whether it's through movies. They'll be very obsessed with the heroes in the movies or video games, and it's that's great as inspiration to reflect back towards yourself and see how in your life there is something truly remarkable unfolding. And that for me, as I say, a living mythology, a living poem, because a poem speaks so much more than what it is on the surface. And I feel like that's what we are as beings on this earth, unfolding constantly new versions of ourselves. We might not know what the next verse is going to be, what the next cycle of our life is going to look like. And that's kind of what has brought me to where I am now with poetry. I would speak on how it was probably my introduction to this book, Mirror to the Light, Lewis Thompson's work, which he's a completely unknown individual in the modern age. I don't know, what his peak recognition ever was, and I imagine it's going to increase now as we become more in tune with this sort of mystical renaissance. He probably catalyzed a lot of this journey for me. In July 2024, I took myself onto a Buddhist monastery trip for about a week, and it was an incredible experience of presence, luxury in the highest form, timelessness, connection with nature, a real appreciation for the subtlety of the transcendent as I experience it through my lens, but also a feeling of real collective connection, And during this trip, I experimented for pretty much the first time in a long time with my own writing. So this is really where it started for me now. And if anyone knows me personally, or as I sort of express more, you'll see that it will probably appear now that I'm quite somewhat prolific in just churning out poetry or prose or some different forms of expression, even if it's through my voice. That was also the time where I was becoming, for the first time, confident in my own expression. I sort of had an identity that I didn't really have access to my full vocabulary, this tension between me feeling like I wanted to express, be seen, felt tremendously strangled by the awareness that there was something sitting dormant, and maybe I didn't really have the conviction in myself, or I hadn't witnessed myself in that new space. I think confidence comes from experience. I would say that experience for me was kind of revolutionary, because I actually was able to see myself as someone who not only could express their thoughts in a seemingly eloquent way when in the right environment. That's the key term. The key point is in the right environment. And most importantly, I enjoyed the expression, and I felt myself in a kind of different place within myself. And I just sort of had this little book with me. I mean, I had this book. I would read some of Lewis Thompson's aphorisms, and the way he wrote was just like rockets of insight within such small expressions. And that is, in my view, a lot of what poetry kind of is. It doesn't have to be impressive. This was impressive to me because it resonated. And so this is where I really understood about the essence of paradox on this trip. And there's actually, I believe, a sort of quote from Thompson, which I'm going to try and find because I think I noted it down. But yeah, Thompson in the preface of Mirror to the Light speaks about the aim of this book is to overcome the mind, even on its own ground. So even with words and language, using the intellect, is to overcome the mind. Completion of hypocrisy, with a capital H. So he has this very idiosyncratic set of terminologies, and something like hypocrisy, which we would generally probably associate somewhat negatively. We'd be thinking, who wants to be a hypocrite? Wow, he's holding two contrasting realities at the same time. What a loser. It's like, well, again, it's impossible not to do that. And if we were to claim otherwise, we would be hypocrites, and we would be in this endless cycle of hypocrisy with a lowercase h. And what Thompson does is he elevates terms to capital letters to kind of say, well, actually, there's a higher expression of this, and hypocrisy is seemingly consciously holding that tension, that contradiction. And that's what the whole aim of the book is. And we really feel that within any poetry, not just within Lewis Thompson's work, as I'm sharing my love of it. But it's the reason why we love even, the classic movie villain is not a good movie villain. Just ask a writer, ask a screenwriter. If a villain is any good, if there's not contrast in the fact that they are so abhorrently immoral and probably psychotic and psychopathic and all of these things, but they're also deeply relatable. It evokes a sense of empathy within us, and that is such a rich tension. And again, that's the essence of poetry. And what's interesting as well, which I think really speaks to the idea of what happens when we really commit to this, is that Lewis says, what is now this book began spontaneously as a series of detached perceptions in my 19th year. Its tension was so great that it tended to continually destroy itself, and he once burned the manuscripts deliberately. Still, it always grew up again from its roots. That is unbelievable to imagine, because if we look at how much there is written here and the quality of it, again, it speaks to me about what poetry is. It's something that rises from our being. It doesn't come from some intellectual fleeting moment. It's something core within us and an experience that we have. And when taken to its extreme, when taken to its spiritual, incandescent extreme, it maintains itself, it regenerates. And I mean, that's incredible. He burned the manuscripts deliberately. I mean, to me, that is almost like, it's such a profound stance to take, and it reminds me a lot of the inspiration he had with Arthur Rimbaud, who famously renounced poetry at around the same year. I think he was 20 or 21. One of the great apparent savants of poetry, a complete genius, and completely shifted the landscape of what we see as poetry, and then abandoned it altogether to live a life of what he considered to be, his actual poetry. And there's so much there to unpack. I could probably do an episode on how I've interpreted Rimbaud's life, because this is a genius who, for all intents and purposes, in any realm, you look at him and you go, this guy is already one of the greats at age 20, even younger. He's redefining, he's defining a whole genre of poetry. His surreal, imaginative works that was so, there was so much reality he gave to his inner experiences beyond those, his kind of like dreams and his astral travels, I imagine, and these octaves of experience that he considers as ontological facts, that they are reality as much as the ground that we stand on is a reality. And what he became so frustrated about was this painful tension that his words could never do it justice, and that essentially led him to live the life that he led, which is such a contrast, such a polarity, and it's a real sort of rift and chasm in the world of literature. Because, again, as I say, he defined an aspect of literature at the time, and then went on to say, do you know what, this doesn't do it for me. Whereas Thompson had the same kind of revelation, yet continued to write. So it's very interesting to see, because he really describes and resonates with the sort of rejection of literature, and on a real painful level, because you get this kind of warm feeling when you read other people's words, and it's giving you, especially when you're one of these souls who has such a depth of experience, and I imagine it's really hard to find others, to not feel somewhat lonely in your pursuits, because the depths you can go in both transcendently blissful and, you know, painfully drowning, rooted levels of your own shadows revealing themselves, that can be very lonely when it's at such an extreme. So I imagine literature is a great place for people to find solace in that, to find their companions on the pages, and then you try and you realize you can do that as well in your writing, and then something just isn't hitting right. Yeah, I think that speaks to how another one of my favorite quotes is just that the poetry is the dance of truth among limits. There are limits, which are its occasion and which it explodes. Those moments of symbolic meaning, when an experience like a synchronicity, for example, which I'm sure everyone has had, whether it's a coincidence, serendipity, synchronicity, all these terms that we use to describe the same phenomenon of, like, one moment happens, it's one thing on the surface, and underneath there are so many layers, right? There's so much more subtext. We read between the lines of our experience, and if we train ourselves enough, we actually can connect it into a whole structure of meaning that for a while or permanently contains more importance to us than things that are more mundane in our lives, like, whoa, okay, the security that I need to have in this material world, or, you know, the kind of fueling the same patterns of fear and anxiety. Those are kind of endlessly insatiable attitudes we might have, and then these moments of, wow, that's just exploded everything. All of a sudden there's a meaning here that I need to explore, and I need to move towards that realm. And again, that's a quality, a trait that unites the poets across time, you know, which brings me on to another one of my favorite quotes. Again, I'm just kind of listing them off now as we reach towards the end of the episode. But Lewis Thompson reminds us that the complete poet was always anciently considered sage and seer, using in language the highest and completest power of man. So true, you know. In the Vedic sense, the rishis were poets, and the word kavi for poet also means seer. So there's an alignment. The same word for poet also means seer in Sanskrit, I believe he's quoting there. And so anciently we revered poets in a certain space. And again, not just poets who wrote things down, but poets who lived that life of seeing everything as symbol. You know, it takes a lot of courage to just kind of become less invested in the details of the material world. And not everyone, I'm not considering that anyone, even including me, is meant to go to that extreme. But to play more with that is what I guess I'm advocating for from my own experience, and that's what I'm doing here now with you. And as you're listening, I imagine there's going to be sparks of creative insight that you're meant to receive, and perhaps meant to do something with and carry with you into your day or your week. That's, as I say, something that carries on from ancient times, you know. The rishis, the sages, the scriptures that were supposedly written by them, or were written by them, famously say so much with so little. And, you know, they define an entire spiritual value system for different religions and spiritual philosophies, right? And that in itself speaks so much about how we revered the poet. And Thompson goes on to say that there was a power of incantation to transform and fulfill the consciousness of receptive hearers. So there's this incantation going on, and the receptive hearers element is beautiful, because if you've experienced a shift or a transformation when reading someone's words or watching someone's video, there was a certain element that you played in that. You were receptive and open to it to begin with. So really, it didn't really matter what it was you were going to consume or be enlivened by. It was your state of receptivity. But he then mentions that in the modern day, it is by vague intimation or memory of this that poetry is still considered in some way elevating or harmonizing. So in other words, we've got a vague memory of these ancient incantations and profound, piercing insight that now we do consider poetry elevating or harmonizing, but we don't give it the same level, the same notion. And he says because the explanations of this and poetry itself in the modern Western and westernized world are reduced to a psychology and to resources of the individual. It's like, he only got on with that poem because he's done some, he's studied poetry, he's a bit of an academic or a scholar. Only those people with those resources, or that person with those resources, they're more creatively minded, they can sit with that. Or just the psychology, he's that type, they're that type. Again, we're talking about something that has gone that at the very beginning of time, when wisdom was there to be expressed. It's not expressed in sort of mundane, limited terms. It's expressed in sort of even Jesus Christ, right? It's a perfect example. And if he spoke in parables exclusively, everything he said was in symbol, and his actions were as such as well. He spontaneously did what was the highest calling in any given moment. He was clearly moved by a force greater than him, but also he wasn't thinking about things. So it's like, you could say he's moved by the Holy Spirit, or he was one with the Father, and but it just fascinates me to even think, like, how was he just having, I imagine he probably had some conversations, but because he was so embodied and so illuminated at all times, everything to him was a complete profundity. There's an apocryphal saying of the Christ that says, "Look with wonder at what is before you. Penetrate this present depth." This is again something completely universal with all poets, that there's a perpetually revealing, ever-present depth, even in the most mundane, ordinary experiences. So because Christ was seeing that at all times, I don't imagine he was really going on about something labels and identities. He was probably talking about, he could probably start a whole parable on the blade of grass that I'm looking at now, like that one blade. So if he can do that at all times, kind of speaks to us on the essence of poetry, and again, Thompson mentions Christ within this context, not just Christ but Buddha and Krishna as well. Poetry is the action, the continuous, unqualifiable excess, the extra-human rhythm, the essential splendor of life. It is the scintillation of life as luxury. The Christ, the Buddha, Krishna are poets. I mean, I think that's a pretty wonderful place to leave it and let those words kind of sink in, and I hope the essence of poetry, which I'm going to definitely explore in other episodes, sink into your being as well. And if I was to leave you with one practical, I've spoken here a lot about things that are a bit more, I guess, transcendent, right? They're not really, well, they are rooted by the essence of me expressing them and expressing my limitations. But if I was to leave you with one practical thing you could do to explore this within yourself, it would be along the lines of journaling, right? But journaling with poetic intent. There's something that has made an impression on your experience. try a bit of disinterested expression with poetic intent and see what happens. Yeah, and that'll be it for this episode, I think, because my next one is going to be much more on that, and there's going to be probably more applicable things, because my next episode is going to be on journaling. Looking forward to the next episode. Much love.